Danielle Brooks had walked the same polished floors of Sterling and Morris Technologies for over 7 years. Located in the heart of Atlanta, the towering glass building was a beacon of innovation, growth, and corporate prestige. But for Danielle, it had become a quiet battlefield. As a senior marketing analyst, she was known among peers for her precision, her leadership on high-stakes campaigns, and an uncanny ability to predict market trends before anyone else even noticed them. Yet, recognition never followed her name the way it did for others. She sat in the back corner of the 11th floor open workspace, her desk immaculate, her screens filled with spreadsheets and pitch decks that had won the company millions in contracts. Still, when promotions came around, the spotlight never turned her way. Instead, it seemed to always land on someone else, usually someone who looked nothing like her. Danielle had watched it happen again just that morning. The quarterly leadership meeting had ended. An internal memo was clear. The new director of marketing was Brad Whitmore, a colleague she had trained 2 years ago. Brad, who had once asked her how to calculate ROI and who struggled with public speaking, was now leading the very team she had envisioned running. The announcement was wrapped in the usual corporate fluff. Strategic realignment, recognizing rising talent, rewarding bold vision. But to Danielle, it was just another reminder of how invisible she was to those in power. She didn't cry. Danielle hadn't cried over work in years. But the knot in her chest as she returned to her desk was dense and unrelenting. She opened the email again, stared at Brad's name, then at the line that said he would begin his new role immediately. Her inbox was already filling with congratulations to him. Messages from colleagues who probably didn't even know the projects he was being credited for had been led by her from the shadows. Her phone buzzed. A text from her best friend, Jasmine, popped up. "Tell me you're kidding. You should have gotten that role." Danielle stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she slowly typed. Same old story. As the day crawled by, she maintained her composure. She attended meetings, gave input, smiled when required, and even offered polite congratulations to Brad when he passed by her desk with a bashful grin and a poorly hidden sense of triumph. She could feel the weight of her colleagues' glances, some sympathetic, others indifferent. But none of them said aloud what they all knew. Danielle Brooks had been robbed. Again, by 6 o'clock in the evening, most of the office was empty. Danielle shut down her computer, gathered her things, and took the elevator down in silence. The sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, casting a golden hue on the streets of Midtown Atlanta. As she walked toward the parking garage, her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated for a moment. It wasn't uncommon for vendors or recruiters to call, but something about the timing felt strange. She pressed accept. "Miss Brooks," a calm, professional voice asked. "Yes, speaking. This is Olivia from the executive office at Sterling and Morris. Mr. Whitman would like to meet with you. He asked for first availability tomorrow morning. Can you come in at 8:30? Danielle stopped in her tracks. The noise of the street seemed to blur around her. Yes. Of course. Great. Please come directly to the 32nd floor, the executive wing. Someone will be there to receive you." The call ended before she could ask anything else. She stood there for several seconds, the phone still in her hand, mind racing. James H. Whitman, the CO, the man whose name adorned every quarterly statement and company-wide video message. She had never spoken to him beyond a handshake in passing. Why would he want to see her? Was this about Brad? About her reaction? Was someone suggesting she had complained? Had someone reported something? She shook her head and continued toward her car, her steps a little slower now. Inside the vehicle, she sat quietly for a while, phone in hand, staring at the dashboard as dusk turned to dark. The initial adrenaline of the call gave way to doubt. Was she in trouble? Was she being let go? But another thought pushed forward. What if this was something different? That night, Danielle barely slept. She went over every possibility, every recent interaction, every project she had touched in the last 6 months. Her mind created dozens of scenarios, most of them ending with her being quietly pushed out or reprimanded for something political and vague. By midnight, she sat on her couch, laptop open, reviewing her work, her resume, her contributions. She wasn't just preparing for a meeting. She was trying to remind herself of her worth. When dawn broke, she stood in front of her closet, more careful than usual about what to wear. She chose a deep navy blazer, a white blouse, and a pair of low heels. Professional, confident, intentional. At 8 o'clock in the morning, she walked into the building with a different kind of presence. She passed through security, took the express elevator to the top floor, and found herself in a hallway she had never entered before. The 32nd floor was quiet, carpeted in soft gray, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. A woman in a sleek black suit greeted her by name and led her toward a large, glass-walled office. Inside, standing by the window with a tablet in hand, was James H. Whitman. Danielle's heart raced. He turned slowly, gave a brief smile, and extended his hand. "Miss Brooks, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." The tone in his voice wasn't casual. It wasn't disciplinary either. It was serious, curious. As Danielle sat down, the CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the country looked her directly in the eye and said, "I want to talk to you about something important. No filters, just the truth." And just like that, the real story began. Danielle sat upright, her back barely touching the leather of the chair, as James H. Whitman studied her across the expansive executive desk. The silence stretched just long enough to demand her full attention, but not long enough to be disrespectful. The morning sun painted angular shadows across the office, and she could hear the low hum of the city from far below. Everything in the room felt heavy with intention, minimalist, modern, but meticulously curated, like the man in front of her. "First," Whitman said, placing his tablet face down, "I want to thank you for coming in on such short notice. I know you probably have a lot of questions." Danielle nodded, choosing silence over speculation. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk, fingers interlaced. "I've been receiving emails, not the kind that go to corporate communications or HR, personal ones, anonymous, detailed, and frankly disquieting. They talk about a culture that celebrates the idea of inclusion publicly while rewarding the same familiar faces behind closed doors. Your name came up more than once." Danielle's throat tightened, but she maintained eye contact. She refused to flinch. Whitman tapped his fingers twice against the desk. "These messages aren't just angry rants. They're precise, specific campaigns, team dynamics, leadership behaviors, numbers, timelines, even budget allocations. And every time I followed up discreetly, the facts lined up. That's not common. It made me pay attention." Still, Danielle said nothing, not out of fear, but caution. She didn't know what this was yet. An interrogation, a trap, or perhaps the beginning of something else. He gestured toward her. "You've been here almost 8 years. In that time, your performance metrics have been consistently among the top 5% in your division. You've led some of our highest earning initiatives. And yet, no upward mobility, no elevation, not even lateral growth. Care to tell me why that is?" She inhaled deeply, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "Because performance hasn't been enough. Visibility matters more. And visibility," she paused, "doesn't come easily when you're a black woman in a room full of people who assume you're there to assist, not lead." Whitman didn't interrupt. Danielle continued, choosing her words with surgical precision. "I've led strategy on multi-million-dollar accounts, trained managers who now outrank me, and seen my ideas presented in meetings where I wasn't invited. I've watched people with less experience and sometimes less skill leapfrog past me because they knew the right names or looked like they fit the image of leadership." Her tone didn't waver, but the weight of truth was unmistakable. "And every time I told myself to wait, that eventually someone would see." A beat passed. Then Whitman leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "This company has grown too fast," he said. "We scale without correcting the culture. It's a mistake I now realize we're paying for." Danielle raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You're just now realizing?" The CEO actually smiled, but it was thin and tired. "No, I suppose I always knew. But it's easy to let the machine keep moving when the profits are high and the headlines are good. These emails force my hand, force me to stop looking away." He reached for a folder beside him and slid it across the desk. Danielle opened it. Inside were printed copies of emails, performance reviews, and internal promotions dating back 5 years. Some pages were highlighted, others annotated. It was a paper trail, a narrative constructed from facts that spoke louder than any complaint ever could. "I've had a team auditing promotion data for the last 2 weeks," he said. "Unofficially, quietly, what we found, it's not just disappointing, it's embarrassing. And the way your name kept surfacing, it became impossible to ignore." Danielle closed the folder and looked back at him, unsure what to say. This wasn't the direction she expected the meeting to go. "Why am I here?" she asked finally. "Because I don't want to fix this through a task force or a polished PR campaign. I want to hear it from someone living it, without filter, without HR in the room to soften the edges." She hesitated, searching his face for insincerity, but there was none, so she spoke. She told him about the meeting where her project was presented by a manager who hadn't touched it, about the time she was excluded from a client dinner, even though she had led the pitch. She spoke of the whisper networks that circulated open roles before they were announced, and how she was always told it just wasn't the right time when she inquired about advancement. And she recounted the countless performance reviews filled with praise but devoid of commitment. Whitman listened. He didn't interject, didn't correct. Occasionally, he jotted something down in a leather-bound notebook, but mostly he let her speak. When she finished, there was a long pause, the kind of silence that allowed things to settle in the room like dust. "I don't expect you to fix this alone," he said, "but I need people like you to help me see what's been kept out of view." Danielle shook her head slowly. "If you really want to see, you won't just need me. You'll need to be willing to break things." He nodded. "I know." Then he stood, a clear signal the meeting was over. Danielle rose too, unsure what to make of it all. "You'll hear from me very soon," he said. "This conversation isn't the end. It's the beginning." As she walked out of the office, back the quiet corridor and into the elevator, her mind was racing, but this time with possibility. Not fear, not hope either. Just a growing realization that something had shifted. Whatever this was, it was far from over. Danielle stepped back onto the 11th floor that same morning with an unplaceable energy vibrating beneath her skin. Something had shifted, not just in her own perception, but in the way the office seemed to breathe around her. As she passed familiar faces, she noticed it immediately. The double takes, the sudden silences, the rapid shift of eyes away from her. A few nods were slower, more intentional, as if to signal solidarity without saying the words. But beneath the surface of polite smiles and casual greetings was something colder, unsettling. Not hostility. Not yet, but certainly discomfort. By mid-morning, the rumors had begun to circulate. She wasn't naive. The executive wing was a fortress, and yet word of her meeting with Whitman had already leaked into the bloodstream of the company. No one said it outright, but she could feel it. Whispers cut off when she entered break rooms. Slack messages stopped mid-thread. Someone had even placed a coffee on her desk with no note, an anonymous offering, or perhaps a peace treaty in disguise. Danielle didn't touch it. Her manager, Trevor Langdon, arrived late, and his entrance into the office was unusually tense. Trevor was a man of immaculate timing, always punctual, always controlled. That morning he looked rattled, disheveled. Even by 11, he summoned her with a vague invitation to catch up quickly, and she followed him to one of the smaller glass conference rooms near the end of the floor. Once inside, he closed the door and sat across from her, his laptop untouched, his hands laced tightly in front of him. "So," he began, forcing a smile, "I heard you had a meeting this morning. Upstairs." Danielle didn't blink. "Yes. Anything I should know about?" His tone tried to be casual, but the undercurrent of anxiety betrayed him. "I was asked to speak about my experience here," she said. "I told the truth." Trevor nodded, too quickly. "Of course. Transparency is important. Absolutely." He cleared his throat, eyes darting to the glass door, as if afraid someone might be watching. "I just want to make sure we're aligned on things, that there's no miscommunication." Danielle leaned forward slightly. You mean you want to know what I said about you? He opened his mouth, hesitated, then gave a half laugh that didn't reach his eyes. That's not what I said. But it's what you meant. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. Look, Danielle, I value what you bring to this team. You've always been incredibly competent. Competent, she repeated, letting the word hang in the air, tasting its weight. Trevor's face twitched. I mean exceptional. You're a real asset. I just don't want any misunderstandings between us to get in the way of future opportunities. Danielle let a small silence bloom between them before answering. That's interesting, Trevor, because for the past 2 years, I've been asking about future opportunities. You always said there weren't any. Trevor shifted in his seat, suddenly needing to justify what couldn't be defended. Those decisions aren't always in my hands, Danielle. There are layers, timing, budget constraints. Except they weren't constraints for Brad. He froze, then stood, awkwardly adjusting his jacket. If you feel there's been an oversight, I'm happy to revisit our prior conversations. Maybe bring in HR to mediate. No need, she said, standing as well. I think I've already said what needed to be said. Back at her desk, Danielle returned to her work, but it was clear the landscape around her had changed. Over the next several days, the shift became more pronounced. She began receiving calendar invites to meetings she had never been part of before, strategy sessions, budget planning discussions, cross-departmental brainstorming. No explanation, no context, just silent additions to her schedule from unfamiliar executive assistants. Each meeting placed her in rooms with directors and vice presidents, many of whom now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Some tried to draw her into small talk, eager to measure her demeanor, while others avoided eye contact altogether. It wasn't lost on her that she was now being perceived differently, but it wasn't admiration. It was calculation. Danielle was no longer just a colleague. She had become a variable. The more visible she became, the more she felt the tension rise beneath the surface of the office culture. Her emails received faster responses. Requests that were once delayed suddenly moved to the top of queues. Even her desk was visited by people who hadn't spoken to her in months, now stopping by to check in or see how she was doing. It would have been flattering if it hadn't been so transparent. What unnerved her most, however, wasn't the flurry of polite gestures or the sudden flattery. It was the silence of those who once leaned on her the most. Her inner circle had shrunk without ceremony. A few co-workers she had mentored kept their distance, unsure proximity to her would be seen as alliance or betrayal. And while some offered whispered congratulations, they did so only in passing, as if speaking too loudly would attract the wrong kind of attention. One afternoon, as she returned from lunch, she found a printed document on her chair. No cover letter, no sender. It was a list, a breakdown of internal promotions from the past 5 years. Names, dates, departments, race, gender, and tenure. At the bottom, someone had scribbled a single sentence in pen. Still think it's about merit? Danielle stared at the paper, then folded it quietly and slipped it into her bag. She didn't know who had left it, but she knew why. Someone else had seen it too, maybe many someones. And now, more than ever, people were paying attention. A week after her meeting with Whitman, just as she was wrapping up a late budget review, her inbox pinged. The subject line was short. Need you today. It was from the CEO. Below that, a single line of instruction. Room 28C. Urgent. Danielle read it twice, then gathered her things and stood. There was no fear this time. No racing thoughts. No speculation. Whatever this was, she was ready for it. The walk to room 28C was quiet, unceremonious, and yet each step felt heavier than the last. The room wasn't located in the executive wing or any of the usual meeting areas. It was tucked into a corner of the 28th floor that Danielle had rarely visited, a part of the building mostly reserved for strategic operations and confidential project development. When she arrived, the door was already slightly ajar. She knocked once out of courtesy, then pushed it open. James Whitman was standing at the far end of the room, alone, beside a large whiteboard cluttered with bullet points, charts, and an organizational flow diagram that looked mid-edit. He glanced over his shoulder as she entered and gestured for her to come in, his expression serious but not severe. "Close the door, please." Danielle obeyed, silently stepping into the room and taking in her surroundings. This was not a formal conference setup. No long table, no refreshments, no polished agenda. It looked more like a war room. Temporary, scrappy, urgent. Whitman didn't offer a seat. Instead, he walked to the whiteboard and tapped the top of a chart labeled Leadership Integrity Review. "I need you to see something." Danielle moved closer as he began outlining what had become, over the last 2 weeks, a discrete internal initiative, a full-scale review of the company's leadership framework. Not a PR move, not a symbolic gesture, but a foundational reckoning. What started as a quiet audit had evolved into something far more critical. The discovery of structural patterns of bias, a chronic recycling of power among familiar names, and informal networks that consistently excluded certain employees from visibility and advancement. He pointed to a list of departments. "We've mapped out who's being promoted, who's being nominated, and more importantly, who's being overlooked. The numbers are worse than I expected, and not just in your division." Danielle scanned the whiteboard, catching glimpses of color-coded data and notes written in urgent shorthand. "And now you want me involved?" Whitman turned to face her fully. "I want you to lead it." She stared at him, expression unreadable. "Lead what exactly?" "The next phase. We're not just auditing anymore. We're building a cross-functional task force. A real one. I need someone who's lived the impact of our failures, but who also understands the business inside and out. Someone who has credibility not just with marginalized employees, but with the people who think they've earned everything they have." He paused. "You know this place better than most of my executives. You see things they can't or won't. I need your eyes, your judgment." Danielle didn't answer right away. Her body was still, but her mind moved rapidly. This was no token assignment. It was risky. Exposing inequity meant calling out individuals, processes, entire systems that had protected themselves for decades. Taking the lead would not only put her in the spotlight, it would also paint a target on her back. She crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "Do you understand what you're asking?" "I do. You're asking me to walk into rooms where people will resent me before I even speak. To dig up the very foundation of the system that gave them power and expect them to cooperate." "Yes," he said, "and I'm asking you to do it not because it's fair, but because you're the only one I trust to do it right." There was a pause, a long one. Then she spoke, her voice level. "I want full access to everything. Data, internal communications, performance reports, promotion logs. I want autonomy to choose a team. No filters. No politics. Done. And if I find that people at the top are complicit, directly or through silence, you don't get to protect them." Whitman's expression didn't flinch. "I won't." She gave a slow nod, still processing. "Then I'll do it." By the next morning, Danielle was given a temporary office on the 28th floor and a project budget that surprised even her. Within days, she began selecting team members from across departments. Not just the usual suspects, but employees who had reputations for integrity, discretion, and a willingness to speak hard truths. She recruited analysts, HR liaisons, mid-level managers, even a junior designer who had once published an internal blog post questioning the diversity in leadership. The first weeks were intense. Danielle met with employees across all levels, often in off-site locations to preserve anonymity and safety. What emerged wasn't just a picture of bias, but of exhaustion. People described years of subtle exclusion, being invited to brainstorm but not to present, being praised but never promoted, watching less qualified peers ascend while they were asked to be patient. Many had never spoken aloud what they had experienced, fearing backlash or dismissal. Now, in front of Danielle, they opened up. The data matched the stories. Women of color made up less than 3% of leadership despite representing over 30% of the company's workforce. White men, meanwhile, held 75% of roles above director level. The pattern was systematic and long-standing. Even the language used in promotion reviews revealed bias. Words like aggressive to passionate, or needs polish were disproportionately assigned to women, particularly black women, while men were described as decisive, visionary, or strategic, even with similar behavior. Danielle worked late into the night, often alone in her new office, compiling narratives, verifying statistics, and constructing what would become the most consequential report the company had ever seen. She wasn't interested in appeasing anyone. This wasn't going to be sanitized. She was going to name what needed to be named. But amidst the work, something else happened. She discovered other stories, quiet, powerful ones, employees who had taken risks, mentors who had quietly opened doors, peers who had stood up and been shut down. The culture wasn't entirely broken. It was buried, covered by years of inertia and selective blindness. These voices became her second fuel, not just the ones who suffered, but the ones who still believed change was possible. 6 weeks after receiving that message from Whitman, Danielle stood in the executive boardroom with a thick report in her hands. The room was full, department heads, board members, senior leadership. No one knew exactly what she was about to say, but the air was tense, heavy with anticipation. She began not with numbers, but with a story of a colleague passed over, then another, and then herself. She walked the room through the consequences, not just ethical or reputational, but financial, creative, strategic. She laid out the cost of exclusion in cold, irrefutable terms. Then she presented the data. The silence that followed was absolute. James Whitman, seated at the head of the table, looked around the room before turning to her. When we created this role, it was temporary. But your work here, what you uncovered and proposed, makes that no longer viable. He paused. Danielle, would you consider stepping into a permanent leadership position? I want you to head a new division, diversity and talent strategy, reporting directly to me. Her breath caught, not in surprise, but in recognition of what this moment meant. She looked around the room, at the same faces who had once dismissed her. Then she turned to Whitman and said, "Only if the work continues. This report can't collect dust in a drawer. This isn't a conclusion. It's a beginning." He nodded, solemn. Agreed. Danielle didn't have time to revel in her new title. The announcement of her appointment as Director of Diversity and Talent Strategy was made internally just 1 day after the board presentation, but the weight of the role landed on her shoulders long before the ink on her contract dried. There was no welcome ceremony, no email from the communications team with a list of her top accomplishments, and no glossy press release. Instead, there was work, real messy, human work that demanded more than metrics or policies. It required conviction, vision, and a willingness to confront people who had long operated without scrutiny. Her first official act in the new role was to commission a full overhaul of the company's promotion framework. Every department head was required to submit a documented justification for each leadership appointment made in the past 5 years. In cases where inconsistencies were found, where performance failed to align with promotions, those roles were frozen for review. The announcement caused shockwaves across the company. Some protested quietly, arguing that the process felt punitive. Others, though fewer, supported it as long overdue. For the first time, there was institutional accountability backed by executive power. Danielle didn't flinch at the pushback. She had long since learned that equity never arrived quietly. Meetings that once carried an air of polite detachment now unfolded with visible discomfort. Executives who had comfortably navigated the upper levels of the organization were suddenly required to defend decisions they had once made without question. Danielle didn't posture or preach. She asked questions that left no room for euphemism. She had no interest in symbolic gestures. Either the company changed or it didn't. Her second major initiative centered around re-educating leadership. She collaborated with external equity consultants to design an immersive program that went beyond typical corporate diversity training. These weren't slide decks or checklists. They were uncomfortable conversations, deep dives into unconscious bias, systemic analysis of organizational behavior. Attendance was mandatory for all executives. Whitman himself was the first to complete the course. Danielle made it clear, change wouldn't be led from below. It would be modeled from the top. Outside of the executive wing, the mood across the company began to shift. Employees who had long felt overlooked now saw visible signs that someone was fighting for them. One by one, overlooked talents began resurfacing. Danielle worked with HR to reopen previously denied promotion requests and reevaluate internal candidates for roles that had been quietly earmarked for external hires. She insisted on structured mentorship pipelines and a standardized rubric for leadership advancement that factored in contribution, collaboration, and vision, not just proximity to power. The ripple effects were immediate. People started raising their hands again in meetings. Conversations in hallways shifted from whispered grievances to open curiosity. Junior staff members began scheduling one-on-ones with senior leaders, not just to ask for help, but to offer insight. The stagnant culture began to stir, not with rebellion, but with possibility. Danielle's presence, once met with skepticism, was now respected in a new way. Not universally. Some still bristled at her authority, whispered about the politics of her rise, or dismissed her work as an HR crusade, but she was no longer invisible. She didn't need approval. She had power, and she used it. Meanwhile, Whitman remained actively involved. True to his word, he attended update meetings with Danielle weekly. He listened. He didn't interrupt. On more than one occasion, he stepped in to remove obstacles when she hit resistance from legacy leaders unwilling to adapt. Their working relationship became one of pragmatic trust. He offered support without interference, and she respected his position without fearing it. Outside the company, Danielle's work began to attract attention. She was invited to speak at industry forums, featured in panels about inclusive leadership, and contacted by other corporations seeking guidance on internal reform. But she turned down most of the invitations. Her focus remained inward, on the place that had once rendered her invisible. She had no interest in being a symbol until the substance of the work was secure. Still, there were moments that reminded her of how far things had come. One morning, as she walked through the lobby, she noticed a new face at the reception desk, a young black woman in her first week of onboarding. As Danielle passed, the woman stood and said quietly, "Thank you. Just thank you." Danielle didn't respond immediately. She offered a small nod and kept walking, heart full, but expression composed. It wasn't about personal praise. It was about restoring a belief that possibility belonged to everyone. Her former manager, Trevor Langdon, was quietly reassigned to a non-strategic department within the company. There was no public demotion, no grand fall from grace, but the shift was unmistakable. Danielle never spoke to him again. There was no need. The systems that had once protected mediocrity had begun to lose their grip, and that was justice enough. Months passed. The company culture continued to evolve, slower than Danielle wanted, but faster than anyone had dared imagine. New promotion announcements became more diverse not just in identity, but in background, skill, and perspective. Teams reported higher engagement scores. Client relationships deepened. Innovation surged. People who had once operated in silos now collaborated across departments. It was a different company than it had been a year ago. Not perfect, not finished, but transformed. One evening, after delivering a keynote at a local conference on organizational equity, Danielle stepped outside the venue into the humid Atlanta air. Applause still echoed in her ears, not for who she was, but for what had been built. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed. It was Whitman. The message was brief. "We have a new challenge ahead, one that will need someone with real vision. Can we talk tomorrow?" Danielle read the message and smiled, not out of flattery, but readiness. The work was never done. But now, finally, she was at a table where it began, and where it could be changed. She climbed into the car, knowing the road ahead was long, and knowing it was hers to lead.